I'm WTOP's Mike Murillo, and we're talking to the candidates for Ward 3 Council. And joining us now is David Krucoff. He's a Republican candidate for Ward 3, the seat, of course, being vacated by longtime council member Mary Che. And David, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to give you the first couple minutes to tell us about yourself. Introduce yourself to all the listeners and people watching on WTOP.com.
Well, I just want to say that I think I started listening to WTOP when I was about 7, 8 years old. And I would put on the alarm in the morning and they would wake me up. And then at nighttime, I was listening to the Bullets games back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
On WTOP. I had Bullets fever with WTOP. And this is when we couldn't get the games when we were playing San Antonio or whatever in the playoffs. So we would listen to the games. So having said all that, thanks for having me at WTOP. I'm a third generation Washingtonian. I'm a third generation resident of Ward 3. And I'm looking to break through the, I think, unhealthy political monopoly in the District of Columbia and to win as a non-Democrat in a ward for the first time ever. And that's never been done before, but we're running a good campaign and we're trying to provide the foundation for which we think would be better decision-taking at the council by providing a slightly different point of view there.
All right, well, let's get right into the issues and start with the big one, obviously, crime and violent crime in the nation's capital. While we're seeing it go down just a little bit when it comes to the overall numbers, especially with the violent crimes like homicide, we are still dealing with a serious crime issue in D.C. We just had a 15-year-old who lost his life on a front porch last week. It was another young person who police believe committed this crime. So obviously, we're still seeing a lot of violent crime in the city. And as a member of the council, how do you plan to go and work with your colleagues on trying to address this issue?
Well, I think I'd like to push back against my colleagues who I think have been unwise over the last few years if I'm elected. I mean, so we have juveniles committing crimes and we're letting them down. We have let down juveniles in the city because we have abandoned consequences as part of the equations. Their cost-benefit analysis does not take consequences into or the cost part of the analysis strenuously enough. So we are seeing migration to the far left and to positions which placate to people who will consider committing crime. And regarding juveniles that you just mentioned, if I am not elected, we could see the expansion of a definition of a juvenile. And I think that would be a grave mistake. So public safety has been a consistent concern for the residents of Ward 3. And I'm hopeful that I can be elected and I can try to have the council be more aware of human behavior and understand that we have to provide empathy and carrots, but we also have to provide sticks.
I want to talk a bit too. You are a Republican, and very rarely do you see a Republican in office in DC. So if you are elected into the council, do you think you can develop that cooperation with your colleagues while at the same time, as you said, pushing back on some of the policies?
Well, I think that I get along with people well. I think that I can crack a joke every once in a while and shake a hand and engender goodwill with my fellow human beings. And I think that that they might be more receptive to a little bit more of a conservative point of view or centrist point of view than you might realize. I think that they are being swept away in sort of a, let's say, a stream of thought that I think is unwise. And I think their messaging also in that realm, and that relates also to public safety. And you can see that where it might be related to things like Fairgate jumping or not being prosecutions not going through to as well as they should. And I think that they're sending the wrong message. And I'm hopeful that if I'm elected, that I can help the council provide a little bit of a stronger message once present.
All right. A recent revelation was this HUD report for DC public housing. So I want to talk to you a bit about that and
Yes.
what you would do with council. So obviously we saw this report where essentially words like unsanitary and unsafe were attributed to DC public housing units and buildings,
Yeah.
which are monitored by the city. What type of policies, what type of legislation would you like to put forward if you're elected to address this sort of situation?
Well, I think that the council is starting to do that belatedly now. You can see messages by certain council persons that have purview over housing that are now quite strong, but it's late in coming. Um, in Ward 3, the housing vouchers are more of an issue than the management thereof, or lack of management thereof, is more of a concern than general public housing that you see in a lot of other wards. But we have public housing here too, and I've spoke to residents of Regency House, for example, on Connecticut Avenue, which is just north of Nebraska, and they just think that their conditions are horrible. They complain about infestation and a lack of a resident manager that is consistent, and that the housing authority has let down their smaller community at Regency House. But overall, the housing authority has let down the whole city and has really been a transfer conduit for federal funds without management. And that's kind of the way things work in DC too much, that we are so desirous of receiving federal funds as quickly as possible, and then we don't manage the process well. And we've been down these types of roads before in the District of Columbia. I'm hopeful that we will never have to be under a receiver again, or a receivership like the control board. But certainly our economy is not looking very strong right now, and we are still spending like drunken sailors.
All right, moving to another topic, the migrant situation. We're seeing these bus loads of migrants coming from southern states, and we're seeing the city respond to that. A new office has been formed of migrant services. Just, I want to get your reaction to what is taking place and how you would address it as a member of council.
Well, first off, I don't think that this should be a surprise. I mean, the Congress has been broken for too long, and they're just beholden to the next general election for the president, and they don't get anything done in the meantime. Immigration should not be that difficult a thing to solve. You increase legal immigration and you decrease illegal immigration. So if that means a wall, have a wall. If that means having a door in the wall and have more legal immigrants come in, that's what it means as well. So Texas and Arizona and border states are swamped because the messaging from the federal government is basically, you can come in here and we're not going to try to get you out. So they're coming. And at the same time, the District of Columbia guarantees a right to shelter. So guess what? We are a magnet for these undocumented immigrants, who I think are usually great people. And I hope that they will become Americans sooner than later. But we have to take care of them by our laws, and we have to. But we have to message also to our members of Congress that it's not just about letting in everybody, but it's also about enforcing the law, which means that you have a sovereign entity, the United States, with a border. That's the way nation states work. So I think that you can't just lambaste the governors of Florida and Texas. You have to also talk to your leaders, in this case, Democratic leaders, and say, let's get the problem solved. Let's work with Republican leaders and actually work on a solution. Let's just not ridicule each other. That's great messaging for your base, but it's not productive, and it certainly doesn't help the District of Columbia.
All right, another topic I want to get into with you. Obviously, we've talked about affordable housing and that sort of thing, but there's been a lot of discussion about what to do with a lot of the office space, especially in downtown Washington, that's not being used. A lot of people are working from home and some aren't going back to the office, and we're seeing just some places go vacant. There's been some discussion about maybe changing some of that building to mixed use and that sort of thing. So as a member of the council, what are your thoughts with what to do with a lot of the vacant space we're seeing in the city?
Well, I am for converting office space when feasible to residential, but it's not so simple. The core of office buildings is much larger than the core of residential buildings. The window line is much more, there's much more perimeter in residential buildings than there are in office buildings. And the air conditioning systems are different. The plumbing systems are different. So it's not such an easy conversion, but I am in favor of those conversions where possible. I think we have to lead by example, which means we have to encourage the federal government to open up. They're the biggest employer in town, the feds. Are they mostly back? Not so much. We have to say, hey, let's get back to work. We have to also try to look for new industries and new ways of attracting people who want to work downtown. I don't think that being anti-motorist, which is something the council does all the time, is a good idea. I think that we also have to look at our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia as neighbors, as people we love to be with, as opposed to, oh, they're just dangerous drivers. The messaging, again, is horrible. We have to encourage participation and work from our downtown office buildings. If that means that we show up in our council meetings without a mask on, so be it. We have to show that we mean business, let's get to work.
All right. And moving to another topic, just 2 weeks ago, we had President Biden pardon simple marijuana possession charge, and that included DC, where those pardons went through. But one other thing he recommended was the Attorney General to look into rescheduling the drug from a Schedule I drug, which is like heroin and LSD, to, something else that's not as strict. And so anyways, we saw this discussion and this order given to the Attorney General. If that were to happen, there's been some groups already saying they hope to push council to have more lenient marijuana laws when it comes to use and sale and that sort of thing. So where would you fall if that were put on your plate as a member of the council?
I am open to the liberalization of, or the less strict handling of marijuana. I also think that it should not be haphazard. I'm not a tremendous fan of the gifting shops. I think that it should be better regulated. I think that, but in general, I don't think that we can put the Pandora back in the box. Marijuana is pervasive in the District of Columbia. I'm not a big fan of its pervasiveness, but I'm not hopeful to try to crack down on it. I think that would be unwise. So I would like to work with my fellow council persons to manage the enhancement of marijuana in the District of Columbia.
All right, to another topic, statehood. Where do you fall on that topic?
Well, you might be aware that I have a long history of advocating for the complete voting rights of Washingtonians. I just think that statehood is inclusive of not just 51st statehood, but also inclusive of a second retrocession. I'm not running on that issue because it's my viewpoint that the majority of Ward 3 residents are yet not open to a second retrocession. But I think that a second retrocession must be studied. And I'm quite aware of the history of the first retrocession and of the lack of success of 51st statehood and the understanding of how the filibuster works. And I am appalled. I think it's abhorrent that the residents of the District of Columbia do not have complete voting rights. And I've felt this way since I was about, 12 years old. I think it's disgusting. And I will work my damnedest to see that we have complete voting rights in my lifetime.
All right. Now, I want to ask you, too, about term limits. It really hasn't been a topic that's been talked about much since 2001 when they were removed for DC elected officials. But, there's been some talk about, should term limits be considered again, especially when it comes to elected officials in DC? Where would you fall on that? You're obviously, if you win, you would take over from someone who's had the seat for 16 years.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. I think that complacency exists in all sorts of forms. And that people become too fixated on getting reelected as opposed to progress. And most importantly, I think that term limits will encourage risk taking. I do not buy the argument that institutional knowledge from people who've been around a long time will supersede the ability or the incentive to take a risk. What do you want to do? You want to have a legacy in this life. At least I do. And if you don't have a term limit, you're not going to take chances. I think that taking chances is productive. I think that if you look at evolution, it's about taking chances. And guess what? Over time, the people that take the chances progress more so than they lose.
All right. I want to ask you, your predecessor, as I just said, 16 years in office. So if I'm going to ask you a two-part question, where do you think you would be alike with your predecessor, and what would be the biggest difference between you and your predecessor?
Well, I think that I would be alike in trying to protect Ward 3. I think that she is not inclined to raise taxes. I think that she did not vote for the immigrants who are undocumented to have a vote in the District of Columbia. I think that she's quite concerned about the definition of a juvenile and about the expansion of potentially jury trials to misdemeanor cases. She's told me as such. So I think that she is protective of judicial practices. So that's where I would probably be pretty consistent with her. I think that I would be economically a little bit more conservative than her, a little bit more ready to either not have growth in district government or actually to cut agencies that are ineffective or non-productive. So I think that that's an area of difference between she and I.
Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure. I look forward to speaking with you again sometime.
All right, David Krucoff, he's the Republican candidate for Ward 3 in Washington. Thanks again.